Good evening, my friends. This is Paul, and tonight I'm so happy to tell you guys that I finally beat Fire Emblem Path of Radiance on the Switch 2. January of 2026 marks the first time ever that Path of Radiance has ever been re-released in any format. Yes, the Wii had backwards compatibility, but you still had to have the GameCube disc, so it was stuck on either the GameCube or the Wii for 21 years, and Nintendo has finally taken notice of this game and is letting more people play it. Now, there is a bit of a but to that, like, you still have to pay for the Switch Online expansion pack, you don't own the game like you do on Virtual Console, you have to pay $50 a year and hope that there's some way of preserving it after the online service is shut down. But as of now, you don't have to exclusively rely on hunting down super rare GameCube games that are also stupidly expensive. And for me personally, I really love the novelty of being able to play this game in handheld. It is an absolute joy to say, I can beat Path of Radiance in my bedroom! Still wish they could do something about adding widescreen, but that's just such a little nitpick in a game that was already basically perfect. Now, I have made 2 videos specifically talking about Path of Radiance. I have my review, which came out in, I think, 2020? Dang, it's been a long time since I reviewed it. And then I made a follow-up called Why I Love Path of Radiance, where it was more so just trying to poetically explain what makes Path of Radiance so great, especially compared to the other games in the franchise. But before you guys think that I'm a fanboy that doesn't think this game can do any wrong, there were a couple of things I noticed this time around that I'd like to nitpick about. First off, I forgot how cryptic this game could get, with some of its NPC recruitments and certain levels having these really formidable obstacles that have a very specific way of being easier to deal with, that I feel like newer players might get a bit overwhelmed by this. Now granted, this is classic Fire Emblem. There are some even stranger unlock methods in the GBA games, and especially Shadow Dragon. But I forgot just how thrown off I was by like, oh, whoops, I had to have this specific character at this specific time, and then this specific character had to talk to one, and then this other character had to... It can be utter madness. Thankfully, there's only a few times this really gets that bad, and for the most part, a lot of the characters are recruited just by Ike talking to them, and there are also some obvious giveaways here and there if you know where to look in the dialogue. I will cut out that long pause, but I genuinely had to think if there was something else that I genuinely hated about Path of Radiance that couldn't just be attributed to its age. Like, sure, I could say, okay, the battlefields are pretty ugly, and the battle animations are pretty pathetic. This was the first 3D Fire Emblem game. The team clearly did not know what they were doing. Either that or the GameCube just really didn't have enough power to do this game justice. But the overall gameplay and the story are just so incredible, especially if you play Radiant Dawn right after this. Radiant Dawn does such a fantastic job of wrapping up all the loose ends and providing a satisfying conclusion to this duology. It's hard to believe they came out within 2 years of each other. That's almost as mind-blowing as what they did with Majora's Mask to Ocarina of Time. But this classic era of Fire Emblem is finally being acknowledged again. For a while it seemed like after Fire Emblem Awakening came out that all Nintendo was ever going to do was just more of the anime nonsense, more of the fan service, more of the focus on interpersonal relationships over a continental conflict with political warfare and switching alliances. That's the kind of stuff that we really liked, and it seemed like Awakening stepped away from that. Three Houses was a great step in the right direction, but I feel like there were quite a lot of people in my review commenting that the monastery was still too confusing for them. Whereas I feel like Path of Radiance does a good job not only of providing a tutorial for just about everything, but a lot of the conversations with the characters are often mini tutorials in disguise. Like, I mentioned in my Why I Love Path of Radiance video that Ike is having some casual banter with 2 of his mercenary buddies. And Ike teases Boyd, saying, oh, well, because you have an axe and I have a sword, I'll beat you every time. So this banter is teaching players if you have a sword and the enemy has an axe, you will have the advantage. All because Ike and Boyd have that kind of brotherly relationship. And I could go on and on. But usually when you're between chapters, there will be this info tab where you can talk to like villagers nearby or members in your party that have some insight. And if you're really paying attention, that can give you a tiny little hint that can help you do better in the next battle. And again, just the whole game from start to finish is just non-stop awesomeness. I don't think there's a single plot twist that I thought was overly contrived. The soundtrack is pretty much perfect. It's all just so triumphant and majestic. And while I personally prefer the instrumentation of Fates, Echoes, and Three Houses, Path of Radiance I would say has the most consistent soundtrack in the series. I can only think of 3 songs that I genuinely don't like that much in the soundtrack, but even then, the worst that I can say about the songs in Path of Radiance is that some of them are passable. But just about all of them have that triumphant, old-fashioned fantasy feel that makes you just feel so good when you play it. Especially if you're like me, where I like to turn all the sounds off and just listen to the music. It can definitely make the battles feel very riveting. Sure, there are enhancements that later games in the franchise did to improve the series in meaningful ways, but in others it felt like it never quite returned to this high-level story. The storyline got way less complicated, and the betrayals and the political warfare and the grounded characters all kind of took a back seat because they wanted to have more opportunities to socialize with your units and have more proportions and all that nonsense. Path of Radiance, for the most part, if you look past the fact that, it's a war game, of course there's going to be some disturbing imagery and subject matter, is a pretty family-friendly game, all things considered. There's really no bloodshed that the game shows. There's no profanity. Really, the most objectionable thing you're gonna see is, some of the girls show their thighs. But, compared to the later games in the franchise, that is ridiculously tame. And you probably wouldn't have even noticed if I hadn't pointed it out, because in general, the character designs feel more grounded, and the story, while it has elements of high fantasy, still feels believable enough that if things like magic existed in our world, it could feasibly have happened. Now, one reason why Path of Radiance was so beloved is that I think the fans can all agree that Ike, the main character of this game, is by far the best protagonist the Fire Emblem series has ever seen. What I love about Ike is that he's a very flawed character, but he learns from his mistakes, and you can genuinely tell that he keeps track of his mistakes and actively takes a stand to be a better person. To give a couple of examples of where Ike's not too great of a guy, he's a bit hot-headed. Sometimes he will disobey his superiors in the army because he feels like that's the right thing to do. Sometimes he has a tendency of speaking whatever is on his mind and hurting people's feelings because he's not used to tiptoeing around people that are more emotionally unstable. But then when people say, "Oh man, Ike, that was really rude," he's like, "Yeah, you're right. I apologize. I'll do better." And he does. But at the same time, he never sacrifices his convictions and his sense of self and his values. He ends up being a rallying point almost to the entire series of you don't need a main character that's either destined by a prophecy or is royalty to be a good main character. Ike is just a simple mercenary that just so happens to have leadership thrust on him when he really didn't want it. He's just the son of a commander of mercenaries. And this gang of mercenaries gets into quite a bit more than just taking out bandits by the end of the game. And I would go so far as to say Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn combined probably have the best story I have ever heard in any medium besides maybe Harry Potter and Zero Escape. Now, I am kind of just going all over the place. This may seem like a pretty measured take, but I've had to go through so many other takes because I'm just so excited that more people get a chance to play this masterpiece. But this also could mean that Nintendo is starting to realize that there's value in the older Fire Emblem games. I certainly don't want them to ditch everything that the newer games did. Stuff like casual mode and more emphasis on the units talking throughout the game is great. Stuff like real instruments helps the games feel even more grand. But now that Path of Radiance has both its game on Switch Online and its soundtrack on Nintendo Music, maybe we'll see the other old games get a remaster treatment, or Maybe Fortune's Weave will have more of a traditional storyline with less emphasis on fan service. The possibilities are endless. But for now, I hope that it gets people talking, and I hope that it gets Nintendo thinking, and I hope that you guys can fall in love with Path of Radiance just as much as I did all those years ago. Now, I've already made 2 other videos on Path of Radiance. One is my review of the game, which came out I think like 6 years ago, and another was just called Why I Love Path of Radiance. So you can check those out if you want more of a deep dive into what makes this game great. But in conclusion, it's got a really wonderful story with some amazing characters. It's got that classic Fire Emblem-ness to it without feeling too overwhelming. It's a good entry point for new players. It does a good job of gradually increasing the difficulty rather than feeling like it has dramatic difficulty spikes like Radiant Dawn did. And it does such a great job of setting up the events of Radiant Dawn, but even if you end up not playing that game, the story that Path of Radiance tries to tell feels like it has a satisfactory conclusion. But if you want more answers, like, okay, who was that character? What was the backstory behind this character's motivations? Radiant Dawn answers all of that and then more. So either way, it's a win-win. Just make sure you play this before you play Radiant Dawn. Otherwise, you're going to be thoroughly confused. So with that, I think I'm going to leave it here. But I hope that if you guys have Switch Online and a Switch 2, that you will check this out. It is free if you have the expansion pack. You'd be surprised how many people just will not play this. And I think it definitely does not help that Fire Emblem has received a bit of a negative light ever since Smash Brothers happened. But try to look past Smash, and you'll see that Fire Emblem is one of the best turn-based strategy games out there. And I'm really glad that Nintendo is starting to see it as mainstream. So with that, thank you very much for watching, my friends. If I somehow didn't get all of my thoughts out, again, I have 2 other videos on the subject that you can watch. But for now, I hope that I got you excited, and I hope that Fortune's Weave ends up taking the best aspects of this game and makes it the definitive Fire Emblem experience. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!